So welcome, everyone. I'm Robert Calafiore, the Associate Dean here at Hartford Art School at the University of Hartford. Thank you for joining us. This is a remarkable series, and we have been privileged to have a wide variety of guests over the years. And today I'm very excited about our guest American artist, and I can't wait to see the presentation. I'd like to start by introducing Dean Nancy Stewart. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, and welcome everybody to this third Auerbach lecture of the season. We have all been learning how to deliver these online and having a lot of fun with that. Be sure to think of a lot of questions that you can put in the chat box and ask our guest. These lectures began 20 years ago in November 2001, and they're made possible through the generosity of our board, the Hartford Art School Endowment, Inc., through the Beatrice Fox Auerbach Foundation Fund of the board. This gift enables us to bring visiting artists to campus each year, usually for 1 or 2 days. And during that time, the artist delivers a public lecture and spends time in the studios critiquing student work. This year, due to the pandemic, we have many restrictions, and all our events are being held via Zoom, including these guest artist lectures. We really look forward to returning to in-person events as soon as possible, but in retrospect, we'll probably always now have an outreach via Zoom as well, because it's nice to be able to welcome an audience from a broader field. So with that, I want to introduce my colleague, Assistant Professor Marisa Williamson, who's going to introduce today's guests. Marisa?
Thanks. Yes, I'm so excited. I'm thrilled to welcome American artists to the Hartford Art School today on behalf of the Integrated Media Arts Department. When I first came across their name and work, I was confused. Who is this person? An artist named American Artist. This must be some sort of glitch, a substitution of name brand for the generic. But as I scraped for biological information, born in Pasadena in 1989, attended the Whitney Independent Study Program in 2017, and found them popping up as the friend of friends in my network, I came to understand that American Artist was real, not a bot. The artist had decided to troll the art world from the uncanny valley dug out by capitalism, surveillance, racialized othering, and technologies that both exploit and disguise certain types of labor and the inner worlds of those who are typecast to perform it. American Artist uses video, installation, new media, and writing to express and explore the sloppy and slippery ways that language, technology, identity get coded, made visible, and turned seductive, inaccessible, and threatening. I am especially appreciative of the ways redaction, humor, the color blue, collaboration and conversation with the living, artists and theorists such as Nora Kahn, Caitlin Cherry, and Fred Moten, and the dead, Sandra Bland, Octavia Butler, and Christopher Dorner, are part of American Artists' interdisciplinary toolbox. They have participated in group exhibitions at MoMA PS1, the 8th floor, the Studio Museum in Harlem, Museum of Contemporary Art, Detroit, the Kitchen, and elsewhere. Their project Looted boards up the images on the Whitney Museum's website 2 times a day. They have had solo shows at the Queens Museum, Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco, and the Gallery Housing, which has moved from Brooklyn to Manhattan. Their work has been written about with exceptional frequency and depth. In 2019, they were named among the 30 artists under 35 to watch by Cultured Magazine. American Artist has a BFA in graphic design from Cal Poly Pomona and an MFA in fine art from the New School. They teach at Parsons School of Design and at the School for Poetic Computation. I am in the process of re-examining our integrated media arts curriculum. American Artist is the kind of curious, conscientious, and community-oriented creative I hope students moving through IMA and this art school might be inspired to become. I still wonder about their name. I've decided it exemplifies a deep commitment to some of the most challenging identities to occupy, being of America when one's ancestors were prisoners in it, and an artist when your work is dense You aren't rich yet, and the pressure is on. At the same time, their name exemplifies a profound critique of these occupations. American Artist is steadily migrating art audiences' thoughts and movements away from what is comfortable, familiar, known, and authorized, toward what is new, latent, troubling, and unstable. They are an artist to follow and learn from. I want to thank American Artists for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction. Yeah, it makes me think so many things about some of my own work and how that ties with what you're doing and exploring as well. And yeah, I'm just really honored to be here. So thank you, Marisa, for inviting me. Yeah, why don't I share my screen? So this lecture that I'm giving today, I want to say that it's a talk on precision, on process, on blueness, on redaction, and on circulation, on what it means to be within a network, all these different things. And I guess as it goes, you can sort of decide for yourself what registers it falls on. It's a bit of an exploration and an experiment into trying to reproduce how it is, I think, across all of these different ideas. So yeah. First of all, when I say distilled, I mean to say blurred. I mean to say bluesed, moved, slurred, shifted, shined, differed, suffered, grafted, choreographed, grifted, thrown, enthralled. Fred Moten, Black and Blur.
Here we are, the Coke has materialized to the level of heat that we need it to be to get to the next level. The molten lava level, the sunken place level. Okay, here we are. The Coke is probably at a couple hundred degrees now, you know? I got the sandals on right now. This is the cookout you don't want to be at, maybe because you might melt into a million different pieces. So here we are, got the iPhone ready, about to drop it in. Hola, as you can see. Fully functioning. This is not a Chinatown duplicate Apple phone. Here we go, you ready? All right, 1, 2, and 3. Ciao.
Process. I'm interested in ways of seeing and imagining responses to the terror visited on Black life and the ways we inhabit it, are inhabited by it and refuse it. I'm interested in the ways we live in and despite that terror. Christina Sharp. This is an image from 1968 from this notable event in the field of computation, referred to as the mother of all demos. That's not what it was called at the time that it happened, but that's kind of how it's become remembered in history. And this was sort of the first demonstration of a graphical user interface on a computer screen by the man in this photo, and also the first use of a computer mouse. And this event, the mother of all demos, became a key event for me to focus on in constructing a critique of Silicon Valley and the ideals that it represents. And Silicon Valley is the part of California that many tech companies reside, and it sits in a direct continuation of many forms of economy that have developed within the United States, and particularly in California and the Western United States. So thinking particularly of the legacy of settler colonialism within the Western United States. So looking at the remainder of what were missions, Spanish missions within California that sort of, became the basis for many large cities, and thinking of the different forms of economy that arose out of that, and Silicon Valley being kind of a continuation of many of the ideals that drove that move towards expansion and colonization. And so, even in simple things such as Mark Zuckerberg's famous phrase, move fast and break things, and this sort of desire for innovation at the expense of all else and all others. And it becomes particularly interesting when you think about who is usually in those rooms making those decisions about what these computers and new technologies will look like, who they will serve, who's going to be in the room making those decisions. And so in another sense, not only does the mother of all demos, become this historic moment in creating a precedent for what a demonstration of new technology should look like, but also in sort of cementing or concretizing this image of the white man at the helm of, this new age technology, and telling us what we're going to be using for the next, 100 years. So that's kind of where this image comes from. My own life for the last 70 years has been a mix of actions, or rather non-actions, relying on an indigenous logic and praxis in which I don't take from the soil anything I don't need and never seek to own it. And this quote came from a work that I did later on titled Blue Life Seminar. But I wanted to speak about the Mother of All Demos in the context of this exhibition that I made at the time that I was researching that, which was called Black Goo Universe. And it consisted of several sculptures and photographs. And the sculptures were really trying to mine something that represented values that were really the opposite of what we associate with Silicon Valley. So thinking about, these new technologies that are always pristine and sort of, constantly making older versions obsolete, and really meant to seem easy to use, but the way that they become easy to use is by hiding many aspects of how they operate, so you never really fully understand how the computer works, which is what makes it so easy. And these are all values I wanted to kind of critique. And also, again, this question of who is in that room making the decisions on what these softwares will look like and who they will serve. I wanted to take up this moment of the invention of the graphical user interface, because it's such a key moment in seeing these decisions play out, because on these very early computer interfaces, prior to the graphical user interface, you had a command line, which basically you would have a black screen and you would type characters, white or green characters of code into the command line. And so thinking of these early interfaces as like, a black background screen. And then in the 70s, the creation of the graphical user interface, which is what we use now, where you have a mouse and windows and folders and all that stuff. When that transition happened, the background of the screen began to appear white. And so I started to think about this, imposition of whiteness as this neutral backdrop of virtual creation as a sort of systematic erasure of that original black background command line. And so I wanted to think, what if the sort of black background still persisted? What would technology be like then? As sort of this radical proposition for what things could really look like. And so this sculpture that I'm showing was titled Mother of All Demos, after that video. And it was basically this old computer made of, well, not old, but it looks old, made of dirt and cement that's kind of crumbling at your fingertips, but really meant to look like it's recently been used by someone. And what are the values of that computer? What are the needs of the person that's using that? Because it doesn't look like anything you've ever seen before or interacted with. Black GUI might then be a platform of slowness, drags time, colored time, refusal, thought, complexity, critique, softness, loudness, transparency, uselessness, and brokenness. And that's from the essay Black Universe that I wrote in conjunction with this exhibition. Precision. Black lives are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery. Skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. Saidiya Hartman. The Black Lives Matter movement began in 2013 after George Zimmerman was acquitted of the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012 in Florida. And Trayvon Martin is the boy pictured in this photo. And I mentioned that as sort of a way to connect with something that kind of frames many of the projects I'm doing, which is sort of, living within this continuation of something that Christina Sharp calls the wake, which is, and also something that Saidiya Hartman refers to when she talks about the afterlife of slavery. Basically saying, what are the sort of conditions under which Black people are constantly predisposed that make us sort of more vulnerable to premature death or, systemic violence, and living within a context where these types of conditions are normalized and sort of maybe even necessary for a country like the United States to operate. And so thinking of that notion of the wake, this continuous thing that we're existing within, thinking about that alongside these many public deaths of young Black people at the hands of police most often. And so thinking of Black Lives Matter as a way of sort of like working in opposition to all that. And so this is something that I've been, thinking about in connection with many of the works I've been doing. So also thinking about other young people that were killed by police that became, these sort of figures for the Black Lives Matter movement. So thinking about Sandra Bland's death in Texas in 2015, Michael Brown in Missouri in 2014, Eric Garner in New York. These all being part of this sort of continuation. I've been trying to articulate a method of encountering a past that is not past, a method along the lines of a sitting with, a gathering, and the tracking of phenomena that disproportionately and devastatingly affect Black peoples any and everywhere we are. I've been thinking of this gathering, this collecting and reading toward a new analytic as the wake and wake work. And I want you to think about this notion of the wake as I show you this next clip from a film that's titled 2015. The riots and protests in Ferguson, sparked by the murder of Mike Brown, and the mass demonstrations ignited by the grand jury decisions not to indict the officers who murdered Mike Brown and Eric Garner, marked the pinnacle of the police's crisis of legitimacy. Around the United States and beyond, people are chanting, "No justice, no peace, no racist police." And this is from Jackie Wang that she writes in the book Carceral Capitalism. And I cite this because I'm interested in this phrase, crisis of legitimacy, that she used to describe the police's feeling like, because of all these accusations that they're racist, they feel like they are no longer useful or legitimate, and they feel like they are under attack and they're under threat of no longer being relevant. And this is what Jackie Wang describes as a crisis of legitimacy. And then how they choose to respond to this feeling is something that I want to talk about. So this is an image of the installation at Queens Museum where this film would have been viewed. And so when you walk into this exhibition, which is called My Blue Window, you're confronted with this large blue curtain, this sort of like ceiling high curtain. And the installation was meant to be kind of formidable and embody this kind of police power that that they give the impression of having. And this blue fabric is meant to refer to, you know, the blueness of the police uniform, but also this kind of bureaucratic, official, you know, power that the police represent, and also a theater, you know, sort of theatricality to having this large blue curtain. And so you walk into the space, you're confronted with a curtain, and you are made to enter on either side of the curtain. And so you enter into the space, and then there's these stadium bleachers where you sit to watch this film, which is this dash cam footage. And it's sort of voyeuristic and almost like a sporting event that you're watching take place. And in the film, it's this fictional depiction of the use of predictive policing software by the NYPD. And predictive policing software is a real thing that's been around for quite some time, at least a decade or so. But in the film, it's sort of a sort of sci-fi looking image of how this might operate. And it's kind of based on how the actual software operates, but it just looks much differently. But at the same time, it takes place in the year 2015. So it kind of looks like something of the future, but it's, you know, meant to be in the past. And the date that's referred to in the video in 2015 is an allusion to the date that the NYPD publicly announced that they would begin using or trialing this software in the streets of New York. The rebranding of policing in a way that foregrounds statistical impersonality and symbolically removes the agency of individual officers is a clever way to cast police activity as neutral, unbiased, and rational. And so in response to this notion of a crisis of legitimacy, the police then insist on something that they call police science, or a sort of objective neutrality that you get from using an algorithm, that they want to say that we're no longer racist, we're using an algorithm now, but the algorithm is actually based on existing data provided by the police. And something that I tried to convey in this video, it's very ominous, but it's also, it's not a spectacular film. You know, there's nothing extremely visually dramatic that happens. I mean, depending on your interpretation, but basically, the video almost has this mundane quality to it, and it's around 20 minutes. But I wanted to kind of show how these violent aspects operate in sort of a subtle way through the interface, and how various people that are walking in the streets are targeted by the software. And many of the people you see targeted, they appear to be Black people, and the film takes place in an area of Brooklyn that is primarily Black and brown. So just thinking of how how this kind of represents these forms of captivity and incarceration that are a continuation of, things that were present during the time of slavery. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about it being representative of being in the wake, as Christina Sharp says. Earth. Sorry, my video didn't play. So Christopher Dorner was an ex-LAPD officer, and he was a Black officer in the force, and he was removed from the force for reporting his fellow officer for excessive use of force. And they investigated it and decided he was lying, and then removed him from the police. And he continually tried to get reinstated, as far as I know, but he ultimately ended up publishing this manifesto in 2013, where he kind of described the racism and violence within the police department itself. And then he went on a spree of killing police officers and their family members, or at least attempting to. He killed a couple people. And so this happened in Los Angeles in 2013, and it was, widely covered on the news during the time that it happened, primarily just to get people to report that he was where they saw him. But as soon as he was found and he was killed, then they never really talked about it again. And, speaking to people on the East Coast, a lot of people didn't even know that this happened, which I thought was interesting. And so I wanted to kind of reconsider, Christopher Dorner, what he did and what happened to him after the sort of rise of Black Lives Matter, because that was kind of at the beginning of Black Lives Matter that happened. And also thinking about Blue Lives Matter, which arose in response to Black Lives Matter, and considering, what it meant for this man who was Black and also blue as a police officer, and having this, moment of going on this radical attack on other police officers. Blue life is merely constituted through the anticipation of violence and the projection of criminality. Blue life is not a personhood, but rather a spectral legal identity that mimics vulnerability. Blue life is no more than a figuration. Blue life effectively obscures the violent operations of police power by attempting to give it flesh. Tiana Reed and Nigel Cunningham. So Blue Lives Matter is a police movement. I think it kind of aligns with this notion of a crisis of legitimacy, the police feeling like they're under attack. And it kind of, I believe it started after the killing of a couple of police officers during a Black Lives Matter related thing. And then police officers feeling like they're under attack and choosing to identify as blue and sort of align as blue, and efface their actual, gender and racial identity to become this sort of blue group of people. And the most egregious part of that is then they advocated for these bills that protect police officers, and they're written like hate crime law. So it protects them as if they're a social or racial group. So police officers are protected as a group identifying as blue. So if you were to attack a police officer because they're a police officer, it's considered a hate crime. And it's really preposterous because the police are already an extremely protected group. If you were to harm a police officer, the consequences are already very extreme. I'm tired of Earth, these people. I'm tired of being caught in the tangle of their lives. So this is a quote from Dr. Manhattan, which is the character in the previous image. And Dr. Manhattan is literally a blue person. And it's a character that I've been curious about exploring for a while, because I was just fascinated with the character and his way of behaving, and particularly because he, I'll talk a little bit more about, what happened to him, but his attitude in the book The Watchmen, which is what the character's from, he's kind of melancholic, he's extremely apathetic, he's also very nostalgic, and it's because he can exist at all time periods simultaneously. So because of that, he's sort of jaded about everything. He's seen everything, he's felt everything. So yeah, extremely melancholic. And because he's blue, he was this Jewish man, a physicist, and he has this freak accident. He ends up as this blue person, and just because of his sort of attitude, it had me entertain the idea of, like, what if Dr. Manhattan had been Black in his human life. And so just interested in how his attitude, for me, kind of tied with the sort of abjection we associate with the Black American living experience. So in this exhibition, which was called I'm Blue, parentheses, if I was redacted, I would die. At the front of the installation is this video, and there's this character that is a combination of Christopher Dorner and Dr. Manhattan. And so he's this blue character, and the video sort of looks like almost like a broadcast from space. Dr. Manhattan famously retreats to Mars at one point in the narrative. And so in this video, you're not really clear where he is, but he's there to deliver a speech about blueness. And this is an image of Christopher Dorner's manifesto. So Christopher Dorner, he had trained his entire life to be a police officer. He was extremely dedicated to being a police officer. That was kind of his whole identity. And then he felt betrayed because of what had happened when he was removed from the force. And so he wrote this manifesto, which is kind of a scathing indictment of the racism within the police force, and saying, like, everything that people fear about, racial violence, like, it's even worse on the inside of the department. And so even though, he's considered this crazy person who went off the handle, it's interesting how much of the critique that he's leveraging is really insightful and accurate for what we associate with the police. I'm an American by choice. I am a son. I am a brother. I'm a military service member. I'm a man who has lost complete faith in the system. So this is a line from the manifesto, and some of the lines from the manifesto made their way into this video that I'm about to show you. And the video is kind of a merging of the text from the manifesto as well as some biographical narrative from Dr. Manhattan's character. And the similarities that I wanted to draw between them: Christopher Dorner, he, as I said, he trains his whole life to be a police officer. He becomes, this incredibly skilled police officer in terms of, his ability to shoot and everything. And he's essentially a weapon of the state in that sense. And he grows incredibly disillusioned with, the racism in the department, how they treated him. And so he rejects all that, and then he goes on this killing spree. In the case of Dr. Manhattan, he was a physicist, he has this freak accident, and then he comes back to life as this all-powerful blue being who can literally do anything. And the US government hires him to be a weapon in the Vietnam War because of his ability. And they just want him to kill people. They just want him to be a weapon of the state. He grows frustrated by that because he thinks humanity is stupid. He's like, I could do anything, I could end world hunger. Why do you want me to just be a weapon? And so he leaves all that. He goes to Mars to sort of just be by himself for a while. And so I kind of saw a similarity in how they were these extremely, tactically skilled individuals that are hired by the government, and then they sort of get fed up with how things are going, and they leave all that, and then have these two very different ways of reacting to it. But for those reasons, I wanted to kind of draw both of them together into this narrative. So now I'll show you clip of the film.
I am blue. It is painful at times to embody this characteristic the way that I do. I have no choice over this. I would never identify with it by choice, nor would I wish it upon my worst enemy. My skin repulses those around me. My presence threatens all that are not like me. I was brought to this world to understand alienation and to be the embodiment of abjection. I find it unbelievable that these characteristics can form a logic of identification, subjection, and anxiety for any human. As we come here today, as beings identified as blue, I ask you to consider with me what value these forms might be of to you. Do you understand my logic? I fear you do not even understand your own. Name, a word or set of words by which a person, animal, place, or thing is known, addressed, or referred to. The question is, what would you do to clear your name?
Blue.
I'm stepping back now and I'm saying, once you become a police officer, once you go through the academy, it doesn't matter what color you are, you become blue.
For the exhibition, I'm blue. If I was redacted, I would die. This is how the rest of the room looked. So at the front, you have the film, and then the remainder of the room looks like a classroom or a conference room, a space where some sort of ideology is being imparted on the people inhabiting the space. And when you entered into the gallery, you would enter from this angle, so you would be confronted with this row of desks with these police shields mounted on them. And so to your left-hand side is where the screen would be. So the academy, the classroom, the conference room, I wanted to allude to all of these different spaces, all these spaces where some sort of ideology is being spread or imparted on the people in the room. And I was particularly interested in the ideology of Blue Lives Matter and the kind of fraternity of police power that we know of the police, the blue line, how they kind of all protect one another. And also this notion of, you know, this feeling of vulnerability and how all of that kind of becomes part of how the police identify with themselves. And so this is a kind of diagram of how the space was laid out. And so all of the desks are in this line, they're facing towards the front of the room. this sort of cross shape on the left-hand side is the computer or the TV monitor. And this monologue that's happening on the screen is a sort of reprimand of the police for choosing to identify as blue. So if you see the full film, he's kind of saying, why would you want to be blue? I'm blue, and it's painful. And it's a little bit satirical, but also very serious in how he's kind of, calling out the police for choosing to identify as blue. And then each desk is a sculpture, and the shield that's mounted on it, it's a police shield, but then it's been upholstered with this blue fabric reminiscent of a police uniform. And the height of the shield is that if you were actually sitting in the desk, you wouldn't really actually be able to see what's going on at the front of the classroom. And so it's like this kind of defensive shield or this defensive strategy where they're in this place to have this information imparted on them, but then they're actually, not able to receive it. And the height of the shield is such a way that, or the height of the desk is such a height that the shield is kind of around the height it would be if a police officer were carrying it. And the desks themselves, the legs have been reinforced and sort of made taller, and the desk is a little bit more militarized to represent this defensiveness and also fragility of the police officers by trying to have this really defensive place that they can sit in and feel confident and secure, but also feeling vulnerable. And so this is another image of the layout of the exhibition, and each of these desks contained a few books. These books that are books written by police officers, for police officers, about family life, about mental health. Books that I felt represented this Blue Lives Matter ideology. And each of these desks has a different set of books. And so in a way, they each become almost like a portrait of these different characters of the Blue Lives movement. So these are some examples of some of the books. Black Lives Matter, Proverbs 31, Police Wife, I Love a Cop, The War on Cops, all these books that are, kind of right-wing, really defending the position of the cops. And the way that I selected these books was, I was looking for books of this nature, but then Amazon continually, the algorithm continually referred me to new books that I could purchase. So I ended up with this collection of books. And they're quite eerie to me. This one in the top middle behind the badge is this daily devotional. So it has these scriptures from the Bible and sort of ties them to how you can, bring those with you on your journey as a police officer. The War on Cops exposes the truth about officer use of force and explodes the conceit of mass incarceration. In fact, McDonald argues, no government agency is more dedicated to the proposition that Black Lives Matter than today's data-driven, accountable police department. And that's from the book, The War on Cops. Sunset. By considering that relationship between imaging and imagining in the registers of Black annotation and Black redaction, I want to think about what these images call forth, and I want to think through what they call on us to do, think, feel in the wake of slavery, which is to say, in an ongoing present of subjection and resistance. Christina Sharp. In 2015 to 2016, I did this year-long online performance titled A Refusal, and it took place on social media, primarily on Facebook and Instagram. And for a year, the images that I would normally post online were redacted with this blank blue image. And it was this experiment, I guess, or sort of display of, visual resistance to the platform that presumes that by participating, you are a product of the platform. And I'm someone who's very engaged in social media. I enjoy social media, which is what made this critique really important for me, feeling sort of an exploitative relationship to social media. And so for a year, I just decided that any image that I would normally post, I would just post this blank blue image that was the same size in its place. And they were all categorized and numbered. And then the actual photograph, I would print it out and make a physical copy, but I would never post it publicly online. And so my social media presence became this, redundancy of this blue image. And that was sort of the moment where I first became really interested in redaction visually. You could think of redaction in connection with my name, but I began to visually explore redaction with this work. It is interesting to note here that the redaction of document 105969591 took the form of a whiteout, concealing a good portion of the original text with white blocks. In this way, deviating from the method of censoring the redacted data with opaque black blocks, rendering any information in the dark. Simone Brown. So this video shows the looting of Target in Minneapolis during the protests of George Floyd's murder in the summer. When every image in the museum seems to be boarded up, every item in the collection redacted, it makes it clear that you are not meant to enter the museum. I wanted to question whether a museum even owns the work it says it does, or if it is in fact all stolen and looted property. So that is from myself. And I was asked to make this piece for the Whitney Museum website for their series called Sunrise and Sunset. And at the time that they had asked me to do this piece, it was, right around the time that the protests were happening. And at the time, the museum was literally, boarded up to the outside. And the Sunrise and Sunset series, for context, it's an online specific work. It's an intervention within the Whitney Museum website that you can only see at sunrise and sunset every day. And it's been going on for many years. But obviously it's not their most visible project because people usually just go to the physical museum. But then during the time of the protests and COVID, the museum wasn't physically open. So the website kind of had this new significance in that was the only way you could really enter into the museum. So this is an image of workers boarding up the Whitney Museum in June. And when I was thinking about what I would do for this project for the Sunrise Sunset, I had already been interested in this notion of redaction. Because of the nature of the project, I wanted to do something where I'm making this intervention into the website. How can I have a direct relationship with the content of the website? And I thought it'd be really powerful to sort of remove all of the images from the website. And so at the same time, the physical outside of the museum was boarded up. And so I wanted to refer to that and how I ended up creating my piece. And this is another image of the Whitney from a different side where you can see the entire outside of it boarded up. And it wasn't an unusual thing that was happening at that time. Here you can also see MoMA boarded up. And this is the new museum. And not just museums, but also, you know, many businesses were boarding themselves up in order to protect themselves from, you know, whatever they presumed these people that were protesting the death of George Floyd, what they might do. And I'm curious what they thought that might be. So when you go on the Whitney Museum website now, it's sunrise or sunset, the website fades to black and all of the images are boarded up with plywood. And so if you go to their collection, they have, you know, an entire digital archive of their collection online. Every image is boarded up. And this piece is titled Looted. And there are many, you know, resonances that are taking place, but for me, I was kind of thinking, you know, what if everything from the museum had been stolen? What if it had been looted? And it looks almost as if it's boarded up in order to protect itself, but I also kind of thought of these boards representing like as if everything is missing, as if everything is gone. And then, of course, questioning a museum in general, what its relationship is to looting. As we know, in places like the UK or in the United States, much of the content of our large, you know, historically collecting museums is looted property from other nations. And so this notion of looting also has a connection in that broader sense. And even though the Whitney Museum itself isn't necessarily that type of museum, you know, it's not the same as the Met. A lot of the stuff the Whitney has is like newer contemporary collections, but in general, you can raise a question of whether museums really own what it is they claim they own. And that's what I wanted to speak to by calling this piece Looted. Playing. Between looking and being looked at, spectacle and spectatorship, enjoyment and being enjoyed, lies and moves the economy of what Saidiya Hartman calls hypervisibility. That last video was documentation of this sculpture that was this literal box and this steel box, and it was called The Black Critique Towards a Wild Beyond. This image is something that I've taken from Simone Brown's book Dark Matters, and it's this thing called a valence plane, and I'll try my best to describe it. It's a bit complicated, but it's this diagram used by Steve Mann, who's a surveillance theorist, and he uses it to describe different power dynamics that occur across lines of sight. And so surveillance being one form of what he calls valence. So if you think of valence as just a sort of neutral form of watching, so anyone can watch anyone, that's valence. Surveillance being when an entity in a position of power is then watching an entity without power, you know, so thinking of the government watching you or things like that, thinking of that as surveillance. And so that prefix sur meaning overwatch. And so then he also offers this concept of surveillance, the prefix meaning under and underwatching. So when a subject with less power is watching someone with power, that can be considered surveillance. So then thinking of, people observing the police or recording the police, that as a means of underwatch or watching entities with power in order to keep them in check. So there's these two ideas of surveillance and sousveillance. And this diagram is kind of used to explore how these different types of valence occur and how they relate to each other. And it uses this grid, this very, classical grid structure in order to chart every type of valence that Steve Mann could think of. And thinking of this grid structure, it's really important because of its relationship to this Cartesian logic of coordination. So, having an XYZ grid is something that's been around in the realm of logic and reason for centuries. And and thinking of that along the lines of captivity, observation, anytime these types of forces occur, there's always this sort of, relationship to the grid, to logic, to reason, to rationalization. And I also wanted to connect it with this photograph, which is from 1940, and it's an image of these police officers in Ann Arbor, Michigan, constructing a police radio tower. And if you look at the basis of it, it has this, square structure and then this catty-corner diagonal square that they're building into it. And I thought it was an interesting image because of the relationship between this structure and observation. So thinking also of police observation booths that they sit at corners of streets and things like that. Yeah. So then in the book Dark Matters, Simone Brown offers this other angle or the sort of critique of Steve Mann's valence plane. And she has this term dark sousveillance. And if sousveillance is sort of underwatch, or watching those in power, dark sousveillance, she contends, is a particular type of ingenuity in order to remain out of sight that was practiced by enslaved African Americans in order to avoid being captured, in order to escape slavery. The different tactics that were employed is something that she refers to as dark sousveillance. So adding a sort of another angle to this limited grid that Steve Mann had imagined. Using this model, but imagining Mann's valence plane as operating in 3 dimensions, I plot dark sousveillance as an imaginative place from which to mobilize a critique of racializing surveillance, a critique that takes form in anti-surveillance, counter-surveillance, and other freedom practices. So I'm conceiving of this work that doesn't yet exist, but I became really interested in how Simone talks about this 3rd dimension. So she's basically saying she's critiquing this original model, saying it's limited in its conception, that it can't even imagine, this other dimension that allows for dark sousveillance to take place. And so I kind of got obsessed with, where does dark sousveillance exist if this grid exists? So this is just this like cardboard model I made to try and figure out, what are the 3 dimensions. And in doing that, and speaking with Simone, what I sort of realized is that it's, on one hand, like it's not like dark sousveillance isn't meant to fit within this Cartesian coordinate system. It's by nature intent on resisting this or remaining out of sight. So it's actually counterintuitive to try and locate where dark sousveillance exists on this coordinate system. So I'm interested in this form, and if dark sousveillance remains out of sight, where is it located? Or maybe it's important that we cannot actually locate it. And so that's what I'm currently exploring, that I want to make into a work. But I just wanted to show you that and leave you with that. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. That was, I have a lot of little notes here. I have a whole little poem of notes, but I want to open things up for questions, answers, so people can head to this Q&A box. I hope people can find it. For me, it's located in the bottom of my screen. And then if you open that, you can submit a question, and I'll keep an eye on the questions and try to shepherd them through the internet here. Some thoughts I have that might just get us started. I love like the way you make artifacts for certain like fictions or actual, unseen narratives. I like the desks. I hadn't seen those or seen them in space. I like the kind of mise en scene that they make and the kind of performance that they invite. And yeah, I wonder how you think about artifacts, whether there's any way that you connect what you do or what you make to a kind of history of spiritual artifacts, like, out of museum sites, you often get masks, and that's a lot of the looted stuff is things that weren't meant to be art, but were instead meant for getting stuff done and connecting with ancestors. And I've been thinking a lot about necrosurveillance, so the surveillance that the dead do, and the many ways you can look both forward and back at necrosurveillance, like how will we be seen when we are dead, and also how do the dead surveil us? And also very literally, the people who've been executed by the police are often speaking and on trial in death, and their deaths have to do some speech act, which Saadia Hartman talks a lot about speech acts of the past, like, what kind of speech acts were impossible in a world of non-consent. So that's a lot of things, but maybe artifacts might be somewhere to start. Something, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And something that I am trying to do with some of these sculptures, like the desk you mentioned, is make something that could be real. Like, I think when you see it, you're not entirely sure whether this was manufactured or not. And trying to tie together how these different power dynamics operate in, real objects, but still sort of creating something that is slightly fantastical, but yeah, something resembling an artifact. And similarly in the videos that I make, a lot of them appear like documentation or documents or artifacts, visual artifacts that are somewhere between reality and fiction.
Yeah, like a parafiction, which I'm always telling my students about, but it's an artwork that operates in between fiction and fact, and is a kind of trend right now. But it's also always been. We have a question about what inspires you to keep pushing your message. How come you don't get discouraged?
That's a good question. I think I don't know if I have a good answer, but I think like I enjoy making, work enough that, as much as there are unpleasant aspects of it, but I think that's what sort of motivates me, which, if you enjoy making the work that you're making, that's kind of going to transcend what is going on externally to that, whether or not people care about what you're doing, or whether or not the real conversation you're having about that work are difficult. That process of creating things is something that, continues to keep me moving. I definitely felt after the I'm Blue show and engaging with the critique of the police so heavily, I felt, discouraged. It was like very emotionally draining to engage in that way. And so from that, I really felt like, I might have to reconsider how I'm doing this. But again, like I just want to make things, and I think that's what kind of keeps me going.
Yeah. Carly says, have you thought about exploring the surveillance? Oh, let me just read that. Okay, yes. Have you thought about exploring surveillance by the police state in connection with institutionalized surveillance shaped shaped through school work? I didn't know that you thought about this. Do you believe that the propaganda we're exposed to in the school system is similar to that contained in the books in your Blues Police Academy installation?
That's a good question. I mean, there's definitely a connection between the police and school and work, or even more so like structures of an incarceration and how surveillance operates in those, how aesthetics and power operate in, carceral spaces, also thinking of bureaucratic spaces like a courthouse. It actually very much resembles, public schools and things like that in terms of the visual language that they use in designing these spaces. So I definitely think there's a relationship. And of course, similarly in how surveillance operates and who has the power over that. There's a lot of direct relationship, even thinking of how a lot of the furniture in those spaces is produced. Some is produced by people who are incarcerated. So I don't know, there's a huge continuum, and police being the kind of right hand of that, state power structure, I think is important. And then as far as the school, material, I mean, obviously there's different intentions that are embedded in these things that are produced for reading material or teaching material. Thinking of, in my own experience, going to school in California and kind of like learning about colonialism through these rosy lens, like everything's fine and that's normal. So I definitely think that there's a sort of conservative agenda that needs to be preserved in these materials. I think because of the internet, people are becoming more aware of that. And younger people are, starting to be more critical through the internet, and kind of like, it's becoming fun to like critique these things, I think, for a lot of people, which I think has some significance in that, at least, even if the things in the actual school don't change, there at least a form of annotation that's happening through like social media and things like that.
Yeah, annotation is a great word. You've been using redaction, but annotation is also a really powerful way to just create meaning through juxtaposition if you don't have the power to fully redact. There's a question about your name. I was wondering, perhaps rather than that direct question, I heard that you renamed yourself in 2013, which is pretty young. And I was just maybe gonna guide that question toward, how did you decide at that age that you wanted to change your name and commit to that change? And where were you at that time? A lot of folks on the chat are probably around that age.
Yeah, I was living in California, where I was born, and it's funny because I felt way older than I do right now. And I think it's because I really, felt like I didn't know how to, become the artist that I imagined that I wanted to be. And through that feeling, I kind of wanted to do something radical as a sort of way of manifesting that reality. And it sounds a bit crazy, but yeah, that's really, why that happened. And I think since then, I've started to, I went to grad school after that, and, I started to figure things out for myself and how I wanted to be an artist. And I think because of that, I feel like I have much more agency now than I did. But at the time, I was like, I wanted to do something bold, and I knew that I'm kind of like a shy person. Like if I just call myself American and someone's like, "That's not your name," I'm gonna be like, "Yeah, you're right, it's not." But if I just make that my name, then like there's really no one can say anything. I can't even say anything. Like it's just the facts.
You like grew into it somehow, which
yeah.
is huge. I mean, the one thing that what is the founder of Black Lives Matter, the one who's an artist right now? She's at I think she's at Otis, but she talks about the activist mentality as one where you have to imagine a kind of utopia for yourself or for the
Totally.
world that might be really extreme. And I think it's sometimes as small as naming yourself what you hope to become and then just working toward it. Someone asks if you're ever if you ever felt fear about showing your artwork that has to do with Black Lives Matter and the Blue Lives Matter movement.
That's a good question. I haven't really felt fear. I think yeah, I haven't felt fear of like, you know, people who disagree with it, like, you know, freaking out or anything. Like, I think the main thing I worry about is it getting sort of like reduced or any of the sort of nuance to it being taken out, you know, and it just becoming something really like, I don't know, something used for someone else's agenda. There was a moment with the I'm Blue show where me and the people at the gallery were kind of concerned about police like seeing it and like, you know, reacting or something. But it didn't end up happening, like nothing really happened. And I think it's partly because the art world is a little bit insulated in a way that I think is actually not a great thing. And also I think a lot of it was more coded than, you know, most like resistance to the cops. So I think even if they had seen it, they probably would have just been like, what the hell is this anyway?
Yeah, the coding is very slick. It's hard to pin down, you know, the source of the monologue.
Mm-hmm.
You can never quite place who the character identifies with. I think that's a real great power of the persona. Is it's just, and that was what Dorner was, I guess, in some ways, was a slippery persona. Did the Whitney Museum push back at all with the looted exhibition? But they invited it, but did they push back at all?
Yeah, they just asked me to do something, and then when I proposed this, I'm sad to say they did not resist at all. They were very excited about it because institutions love publicly criticizing themselves because it actually makes them look better. So no, they did not resist it.
Someone has a question. What is the biggest challenge have you faced as a Black man in your career path? And I was wondering if I could sneak in questions about melancholia and mental illness, which kind of moves through your work as far as like a kind of obvious part of the conditions of some of your subjects. And then also as something I would imagine the idea of blueness and Blackness serve as a kind of metaphor for, like what does it mean to be sunken or to be sad, and how can themes of the literal blues, which I've been interested in recently, especially the theme of like, should I stay or should I go, as a kind of refrain in the blues that I think comes from some of that wake work discussion of like, can we stay here? Can we stay on board? Can we keep living in the wake? So I just wonder if you could speak to what it feels like to be a Black man doing what you do with all of that in there also.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, as far as the first part of like what's been the biggest challenge, I think like it's pretty often that like people don't take me seriously, like not so much in art, because I think in art there's, you know, a pretty big precedent of like, you know, young Black artists doing their thing. But I feel like particularly in academia, like people do not see me as like a professor or anything like that. I mean, not that I'm a full-time professor, I'm an adjunct professor, but I'm still a professor. And that's something where I've really felt more, I guess, I want to say like unique. Like, I do feel like there are a lot of Black male artists, but there's not a lot of Black male teachers. And so that's a realm where I really have felt, like my presence is on one hand like extremely important, but I also feel like very vulnerable. And I think in that context, it also feels like an extreme weight in terms of like I feel like I'm the only one who has to like talk about certain issues. I have to be able to sort of accommodate difficult emotions that anyone might have, any student, any faculty, and myself included, because like I'm the person who's like had the hardest time, like whatever in whatever sense. So I'm expected to kind of contend with so many things. And at the same time, I'm like, I kind of am the only one because there's all these other people here that are so clueless. So I am going to do it because if I don't do it, no one else is either. So I feel like that's the biggest place I've felt that. I don't know. I'll leave it with that. And then around, let's see, some of these other things, melancholy and mental illness. I think along the lines of melancholia and this notion of the wake, that's something that I kind of described, this feeling of what it means to be in the wake to some of my students as like, even though it's something that, we're talking about feeling predisposed to, death essentially, and being in a context where our family members are dying younger or dying more frequently, or friends and things like that, and what it means for that to kind of be just how things are, I guess. And I think that sort of engaging with this legacy of other Black people that have been here or that have said these things, it actually, even if it sounds sort of melancholic, I think it's actually validating and sort of, positioning myself within this long continuation of other people that have already been here and have felt this. So it's like, even if it feels melancholic, it also feels almost comforting in a way to like, see yourself within this continuation. So that's kind of what I would say about that. I guess with Blackness and Blueness, I think these like, especially Blueness, it's such a like contended thing. And that's really what I wanted to explore, because like I showed the image of this early work where I used blue. I had this idea that it was kind of like, it had this potential, this color had this potential for some sort of like, form of representation that's, I won't go into detail, but I just had a sort of positive connotation with it. And then seeing how overdetermined the color blue is politically, historically, seeing how the police were using it, I realized how overdetermined it is and how, many ways it can sort of like be used or be weaponized. And so then I wanted to kind of critique that or look at how the police were using it. And so I feel like blue in particular is this extremely contended space where it's like Black people, associate blue with the blues and feeling some sort of, authority over, what blue is and how to use it. But then at the same time, you have like the police doing the same thing. And I think that's like extremely interesting. And so that ambivalence is something that I really want to, talk about in the work.
Thank you for that. Touching on so many things. I think we don't have that much time left, so I'm going to try to, again, smush some questions together. We have a question about collaboration, how much coding do you do? But I think I'll kind of consider that a question wrapped into maybe like, how do you collaborate with people? How do you, this toolkit, like when you know you want to make something, how do you gather a toolkit that's both collections of skills, but then also maybe a gathering together of the people who can help you get the work done? And how do you go about managing that, maybe, or what advice do you give to people?
That's a great question. I mean, I haven't done a lot of collaborations in terms of like, I guess, conceiving of the project. The most notable one was the one I did with Sandra Perry and Caitlin Cherry and Nora Khan. That one was like extremely collaborative, like at every stage of the process. But with some of my other work, I feel like I've like hodgepodge together different skills that I've gathered throughout my life, that I'm not an expert at any of them, but they're just things I know how to do. Like I have some sculptural knowledge, I have some coding knowledge, I don't know, like different things like that. And I try and do as much as I can myself. And then if like, let's see, like with the I'm Blue show, I didn't make the film myself. I made the character, and I was doing a residency at Pioneer Works, or like tech residency, where there's people that will help you do a digital project. And so I worked with Tommy Martinez, who was there, and him and another person helped me like animate the film. So I only made the character, but I didn't make the entire film. I like wrote the script, you know, and so that was an example where like I knew I could not do that by myself, but if I didn't have that residency, I probably like would have done something entirely different. Like I knew, because I had that opportunity, I was like, okay, I'm gonna try and experiment or do something else. But yeah, like I guess just, I don't know, I feel like I'm not really saying anything useful. Figuring out what you can do by yourself and kind of like, you know, going to the fullest extent of what you can do by yourself, and also conceiving of the project within the constraints of what you think you can do. But then if you do have that opportunity to work with someone else, or if you have like a grant and you could hire someone, then you can be like, okay, let me take this up to another level. And ideally, like, you can find people that you actually like to work with, not just, you know, anyone who has the skills, but someone who you think can inform the project or respond to the project in like a productive way.
Cool. Okay. There's still some good questions. People are excited and inspired, but I think we have to stop there. But I hope someone wants to know if you'll come to Connecticut after the pandemic and just hang out with us, which you will too someday. It's nice of you. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Marisa. Thank you, American Artists. Thank you, audience, for joining us. On behalf of the Hartford Art School, University of Hartford, it's been another great Auerbach lecture. And I also do hope that you can come and visit us when the time is right. Thank you. And join us for the next two lectures. On March 25th, we will be hosting Nina Janelle Abney, and on April 13th, Althea Murphy Price. Nina Janelle Abney will be hosted by the Foundations Department and Professor and Associate Dean Mark Snyder, and Althea Murphy Price is being hosted by the Printmaking Department and Professor Tatiana Potts. So join us for those two. And again, American Artists, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Thank you, everyone.
So much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.